My name is Alfred Turner. Alfie, they called me back then. I was 19 when I first saw death, real death. Not the kind in books or at the end of a film reel, but the kind that grabs you by the collar, breathes in your face, and asks you what you're really made of. The kind that has a smell, blood, cordite, salt water, and something else, something final. I grew up in East London, just off Roman Road. The kind of place where the streets are narrow, and every face you see is familiar, even if you don't know their name. My father was a tram conductor, his clothes always carrying, the scent of engine grease mixed with the faint bitterness of tobacco. He had hands like tree bark, rough, cracked and strong from years of hard work. My mother was a miracle worker with pennies. Her cooking stretched beyond limits. Her stews, thick with vegetables, her tea strong enough to wake the dead. She was the heart of our home, her laughter and fierce spirit filling the small flat we called ours. I had two little sisters, Millie and Joan. They were troublemakers, tying my socks in impossible knots and disappearing down the alleyways, squealing with laughter. They didn't mind the war talk. They didn't understand it yet, not really. They just wanted me to come play. Life back then was like a slow-moving river, predictable and safe in its way. I worked part-time at Mr. Harwood's grocer's shop, stacking tins of peaches and trying not to mix up the corned beef with the spam. I had my eyes set on Mary Fellows, the fishmonger's daughter. Mary was a handful, curly hair that bounced. When she walked, a mischievous smirk that said she knew more than she let on. She knew I fancied her, of course. Girls always do. When the war broke out in September 1939, it was like the world tilted on its axis overnight. The posters appeared everywhere. Your country needs you, with Lord Kitchener pointing like he meant you personally. We were swept up in a tide of patriotism and excitement. None of us understood what war really meant, how brutal and unforgiving it would be. We thought we were heading out to play heroes, to protect our homes and win glory. The day I signed up at the recruiting office, the air was electric. The men around me were laughing, joking, slapping backs. I felt a knot in my stomach, half excitement, half fear. But I didn't show it. I wanted to be brave. I wanted to do my bit. That was the calm before the storm. Training was a world away, from the quiet streets of East London. When I arrived at the camp, the smell of fresh earth, sweat, and gun oil hit me like a punch. The drill sergeants were men who looked like they'd been carved from stone. Sharp eyes, no nonsense, and voices that could make your knees wobble. They didn't care if you were scared or if you'd never held a rifle before. They only cared if you could follow orders. The first days were brutal. Waking before dawn, crawling through muddy trenches, running until your lungs burned, and learning how to aim and fire a Lee Enfield rifle with deadly accuracy. My fingers ached from handling the cold steel, but I was determined. I wasn't just learning to fight. I was learning to survive. It was during those long days that I met the men who would become my brothers in arms. There was Tommy, a cheeky Yorkshire lad with a laugh that could shake the trees. Joe, a quiet giant from Newcastle who rarely spoke, but when he did, everyone listened. And Harry, the joker of the group, always ready with a wisecrack, even when we were exhausted. We shared rations, stories, and dreams of what life might be like when this madness was over. Despite the hardship, there were moments of humour that kept us sane, like the time Harry tried to teach Tommy how to whistle and ended up with a mouthful of mud instead. Or the night we sang old music hall songs around a crackling fire, voices rough but hopeful, echoing in the cold night air. We trained not just for war, but for the bonds that war would test. We learned to trust each other with our lives, because soon enough, that's exactly what we would have to do. When the orders came to board the trains bound for France, the air was thick with nervous excitement. The countryside blurred past the windows as we crossed the channel, the unknown stretching before us like a dark canvas. None of us said much, but I could feel the weight of what was coming. And so we went forward together. Friends, soldiers, boys caught in a storm bigger than any of us could imagine. May 1940 arrived like a sudden, violent thunderclap. We had heard whispers of the German advance, rumours, radio reports, scattered news, but nothing could prepare us for the sheer speed and ferocity of the blitzkrieg. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen or imagined. The German tanks weren't just machines. They were metal beasts tearing through fields, forests, and villages with relentless force. They moved fast, faster than any army we'd faced before, like a flood breaking through a dam. The air was filled with the staccato rattle of machine guns, the roar of engines, and the shrill scream of dive bombers slicing through the sky. The Luftwaffe's Stukas, those screeching devils, would dive from the clouds, releasing their bombs with terrifying precision, then pull up just before crashing, the sirens on their planes wailing like banshees before destruction. I still remember the smell. Smoke mixed with something acrid, like burnt rubber and scorched earth. The ground shook beneath us, and towns we'd passed just days before turned to rubble overnight. Buildings we'd admired for their quaint charm, churches, bakeries, homes, were reduced to piles of bricks and twisted metal. We retreated fast, marching under relentless pressure. Our commanders tried to keep us organized, but chaos was all around. Roads were clogged with soldiers, vehicles, and refugees fleeing the same nightmare. The cries of the wounded and the groans of the dying mixed with the constant drone of planes and artillery. On one stretch near Cambrai, I saw a family frantically pushing a pram, their baby crying as flames licked the trees nearby. A soldier tried to help them cross the road, and the next moment, a bullet tore through his neck. He dropped like a rag doll, blood pooling beneath him. I'll never forget the look in the father's eyes, sheer horror and disbelief. We were running low, on food and water. Sometimes we scavenged abandoned farms for whatever we could find. I remember gnawing on a raw carrot found in a cart, cold and bitter, just to stave off hunger. We slept in the dirt, boots soaked with mud and sweat, muscles screaming but no, time to rest. In a rail yard outside Lens, our unit tried to hold a perimeter, but the German artillery zeroed in on us mercilessly. Shells exploded around like thunderclaps, and shrapnel cut through the air with deadly intent. Jenkins, who had always been so meticulous with his journal, lost 3 fingers that day. Reggie Brown vanished in a cloud of smoke. We never found him again, just his helmet lying in the mud. Every day was a fight for survival, a brutal test of endurance and courage. And all the while, the enemy pressed on, driving us back toward the sea and the uncertain hope of rescue. We finally reached Dunkirk on foot, after what felt like an endless, brutal march. Our clothes were stiff with grime, boots cracked and blistered from pounding the roads day after day. The air smelled thick with salt and smoke. And then there it was, the sea, the Channel. So close, so impossibly blue, and yet so far from safety. I thought seeing the sea would bring relief, maybe hope. But the beach wasn't the salvation we imagined. It was a graveyard, stretches of sand littered, with abandoned vehicles, shattered weapons, and bodies. Smoke curled into the sky from burning ships, the acrid smell of oil and death choking the air. The sound was unbearable. The constant roar of guns, the whine of planes overhead, the distant booms of explosions. It was as if the world had been reduced to that narrow strip of sand and sea. We were trapped. There were hundreds of thousands of us, tangled together like ants caught in a flood. Men crouched in trenches barely deep enough to hide their trembling bodies. Queues stretched for miles, for food, for water, for evacuation tickets, for a chance to live. But the lines moved so slowly that it hardly seemed worth it. We were waiting on the edge of the world. The Germans pressed in behind us, their tanks and troops closing the noose, while the Luftwaffe ruled the skies with terrifying impunity. Every day The Stukas would scream down in waves, dropping bombs that turned men into human shrapnel. I saw things I can barely describe. A medic with no arms, staggering like a drunken ghost, still trying to help the wounded. Men running toward the water, on fire, screaming for their mothers. Soldiers who had lost limbs but kept crawling, desperate to survive. We dug shallow trenches in the sand. Coffin slots, we called them. They offered little protection, but the act of digging gave us something to do, something to focus on, besides the terror. I huddled in one of those trenches, writing a letter to Mary by the flicker of a cigarette lighter. I told her that if she ever found it, I didn't expect to make it out alive. I begged her to tell my family I tried. I slipped the letter into my shirt, but that shirt is long gone now, lost in the chaos. On the beach, time lost all meaning. Days and nights blended together into an endless haze of waiting and dread. Hunger gnawed at us relentlessly. I tried to eat part of a mouldy biscuit that had been passed around, ignoring the taste because it was all I had. Men went mad or broke down sobbing. Some prayed, others cursed. Many just stared out at the horizon, willing the sea to bring salvation, and then the little boats came. Time on that beach was a cruel joke. It stopped making sense. Minutes stretched and collapsed like waves breaking on the shore. Days bled into nights, and nights back into days. The sun burned high overhead, then disappeared behind clouds, but we barely noticed. My watch had long since cracked during a skirmish near Ypres. Without it, I was untethered, lost in a drifting world where hunger and fear were the only constants. We slept in shifts, if we slept at all. Often, exhaustion won over, and I would slump against a weathered crate or a pile of sandbags, only to be jolted awake by a scream or the whistle of a falling bomb. The sound of planes was constant, a buzzing, roaring threat. Above us, Stukas swept low, screaming their death song. We called them screechers. The sound still echoes in my nightmares. Hunger gnawed at us with relentless teeth. Food was a memory. I scavenged what I could, half-rotten carrots, scraps of hardtack, stale biscuits passed from hand to hand. The taste didn't matter anymore. What mattered was staying alive. There was a strange, desperate camaraderie. We were bound together by the absurdity of it all. Boys and men from every corner of Britain, thrown onto the same patch of sand and sky. I met Hamish McBride, a Glaswegian, lad with a bark for a laugh and a heart bigger than his kilt. He told me stories of his family's farm, of pies stolen from windowsills and blamed on the dog. We made a pact. Whoever survived would visit the other's family. I still carry that promise with me. Some tried to keep their spirits alive with laughter, jokes, even songs. Others fell silent, staring blankly out at the endless sea. Many wept openly, their sobs mixing with the cries of the wounded and the distant thunder of artillery. One night, as we huddled together under a ragged tarp, a shell landed nearby without warning. The blast threw me off my feet. When I scrambled back, I saw Hamish. Part of his face was gone. Just gone. The boy who promised to open a bakery lay broken on the sand. I buried him under a canvas, took his cap, and kept it close ever since. That night, I helped dig out 2 boys trapped in a collapsed dugout. One clutched a photo of a girl whispering her name. Eleanor. Eleanor. Like a prayer against the madness. The beach was no longer a place of hope, but a place suspended between life and death. The sea whispered its secrets, the sky threatened its fury, and all we could do was wait. By the 4th day on the beach, many of us were broken, not just in body, but in spirit. Some men wept openly, their grief spilling out like the tide, uncontrollable and raw. Others sat in silence, faces ashen, eyes locked on the endless horizon as if willing an answer from the waves. The air hung heavy with despair, the taste of salt and fear thick on our tongues. Then, like a flicker of light, through the darkness, movement appeared on the water. At first, it was barely noticeable. small, distant shapes bobbing on the waves, almost illusions born from exhaustion and heat. We blinked, rubbed our eyes, told ourselves it couldn't be real. But those shapes grew larger, clearer. Boats, civilian boats, small fishing vessels, yachts, pleasure steamers, paddle boats, ordinary folk from England crossing the channel to rescue us. A young soldier next to me broke down crying. I didn't blame him. After days trapped in the nightmare, hope was a fragile thing, too easy to shatter. But here it was, fragile and shining. The boats drew closer, and I spotted Arthur, a fisherman with silver hair and sea-worn hands. His jumper was stained, his eyes tired and haunted from days of battling the channel. When he reached out and pulled me aboard his tiny craft, I barely had the strength to speak. "Why'd you come?" I croaked, throat thick with salt and dust. Arthur looked at me like I'd asked why the sun rises. "Because you're ours," he said simply. The pride and determination in his voice cut through the fog of fear. Our boat was packed beyond safety. 9 men crammed onto a vessel made for 6. The sea churned, cold and unyielding beneath us. Every time a shell exploded nearby, the boat rocked violently. A destroyer behind us erupted into flames, lighting the sky like a terrible bonfire. Men screamed as they fell into the icy water, their cries lost beneath the roar of engines and gunfire. There was no room to help, only tears and silence. Arthur gripped the wheel, eyes scanning the horizon for danger. His hands trembled, but he never wavered. We were his responsibility, his countrymen, and he would not let us fall. That crossing was hours long, hours of terror and fragile hope. When we finally reached Dover, the shore was shrouded in mist. Women stood waiting, their faces etched with worry, but also fierce determination. They offered blankets and tea, their hands steady, even as they welcomed us back from the edge. One woman reached up and touched my cheek gently, whispering, "Welcome home." I wanted to believe I was home, but in my heart, I was still on that beach, still waiting, still fighting. We arrived in Dover at dawn. The mist hugged the shoreline like a shroud, softening the harsh edges of the world after what felt like a lifetime in the nightmare. The sea was calmer here, but it carried the echoes of what we'd left behind. Shouts, explosions, the screams of men swallowed by the water. As our boat scraped against the pier, I barely had the strength to stand. My legs were jelly, my body aching in places I didn't know could hurt. The women waiting on the shore were like angels, faces worn from worry and hard work, but filled with a fierce, welcoming light. They wrapped us in blankets, pressed flasks of hot tea into our hands, and murmured words of comfort. They cheered, for us, but I felt like a ghost, hollow and lost. A woman came closer and reached up, brushing the grime from my cheek with her hand. Her eyes were soft but fierce. "Welcome home," she whispered. I wanted to answer, to say thank you, to tell her what I'd seen, but the words stuck in my throat. They took us to a church hall, turned into a makeshift recovery center. It smelled of disinfectant and stale bread. I found a corner and collapsed. Sleep took me like a wave, and I didn't wake for 16 hours. When I finally opened my eyes, I screamed. The nightmares that had haunted my dreams spilled into the waking world, and I could no longer keep them contained. The nurse came running, her face calm but concerned. "It's normal," she said softly. "It'll pass." But it never truly passed. The images stayed with me. The faces of men dying, the screams, the endless sand and sea. They haunted my every step. I wrote to Hamish's mother, telling her he had been brave, a good lad. I didn't tell her about the state I found him in, or the cap I took from his lifeless hand. Some things are better left unspoken. Orders came for us to be retrained, sent to Africa next. I nodded when they told me, but the boy who had joined, the army for adventure, was gone. In his place was a man carved by war, scarred, silent, and tired. I saw Jenkins again, the one-handed lad still scribbling furiously in his journal. "I have more stories than ever now," he said quietly. "People should know about what happened here." I wanted to write it all down, but words felt too small, too weak. Yet, here I am, telling you now. The war ended. Somehow, against all odds, I made it home. The world had changed in ways I still struggle to understand. But the familiar streets of East London greeted me like an old friend, worn but steadfast. Mary was waiting for me. She hadn't given up hope, not once. Her smile was a light in the dark, a reminder that life could still be ordinary, still be beautiful. We married in 1946 in a small church not far from Roman Road. The day was bright but cool, the kind of spring morning that promised new beginnings. We had 2 boys, Peter and Thomas. Watching them grow up felt like an act of defiance against everything the war had tried to take from me. The future, joy, normalcy. I took a job delivering post, walking the same routes every day for 32 years. Rain or shine, snow or heatwave. I carried letters, postcards and parcels, little pieces of people's lives. I never carried a weapon again. The weight of the rifle I left behind was replaced by the weight of memories I couldn't shake. For years, I kept Dunkirk locked inside me. Not even Mary knew the full extent of what I'd seen and felt. The nightmares came and went like unwelcome visitors, but I learned to live with them. Only once, when Peter was 12, did he ask me if I had ever been scared during the war. Every damn day, I told him honestly. And then I shared a truth I wish I'd learned earlier. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward, despite the fear, walking through the darkness even when you can't see the light. I visited Hamish's family once, years after the war ended. His mother invited me in, feeding me stew as if I were one of her own. She called me son that day, and I left his cap on their mantelpiece, a silent tribute to a friend who never made it home. Mary would sometimes catch me staring out the window, eyes distant. I wasn't just looking at the sparrows. I was listening to the whispers of the past. The Channel's roar still echoed in my ears, mingled with laughter and gunfire. I learned to live with the ghosts. They are part of me now, reminders of where I've been, what I've lost, and the fragile hope that carried me through. Now, at 99 years old, I spend most days sitting by the window in my small flat, watching the world move on without me. The sparrows dart around the garden below, carefree and lively. Their chatter sometimes carries me back, as if the Channel itself whispers in the breeze. Sometimes I close my eyes and I can almost hear it, the distant roar of the waves crashing against the shore at Dunkirk, the relentless pounding of artillery, the cries of men trying to survive. The salty air fills my lungs, mixed with the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder. And for a moment, I'm there again. They call it the miracle of Dunkirk, a great rescue, a turning point in the war. But I never saw it as a miracle. It was raw and brutal and human. It was boys, just boys, holding a line with trembling hands, desperate hearts, and the will to live. I remember the faces, not just Hamish's, but the medic who tried to save everyone, the old fisherman Arthur who braved the shells to get us home, the frightened young lad clutching a photo of his sweetheart, the brave Jenkins still scribbling his notes with one hand. All of them are stitched into the fabric of my memory. It was fire and water. It was grit and heartbreak. It was hope, stubborn, painful hope. And it was all we had. I sometimes wonder if the world will ever truly understand what we went through. The fear, the loss, the camaraderie forged in the mud and blood, the feeling of being trapped with nowhere to go but forward, even when forward meant death. I carry those memories like scars, some visible only to me. They remind me who I am, where I've come from, and the price of freedom. I was trapped at Dunkirk, and I remember everything. After the war, the world seemed different to me, though really, I was the one who had changed. The noise of battle was replaced by a haunting silence. Not just the absence of gunfire, but a silence filled with all the things we couldn't say. When I returned to East London, the streets felt familiar but distant, like a photograph that had faded around the edges. The tram lines still ran, and Mr. Harwood's grocer shop was still there, though he had grown older and slower. The faces of neighbours and friends were the same, but I could see now how fragile life had become for all of us. The hardest part was the quiet inside my own head. Memories of Dunkirk played over and over like a scratched record. I would wake up sweating, the cries of men echoing in my ears. Sometimes I thought I could still smell the salt and smoke, even in the safety of my own bed. Mary was patient as a woman could be. She didn't press me to talk, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She knitted, hummed softly, or just sat beside me, letting the silence fill the room without pressure. She was my anchor, and without her, I don't know if I would have made it through those early years. Friends came back too, but some were missing or changed beyond recognition. I kept Jenkins' journal for a while, reading his words as a way to understand what we had all been through. His handwriting was shaky, but the stories were clear, stories of fear, hope, and brotherhood. When I read it, I could almost hear his voice. But the war had left a shadow. It wasn't just the physical scars or the loss of friends, it was a deeper wound. Sometimes I felt like I was living in two worlds. The one before the war, where life was simple and carefree, and the one after, where every smile hid pain and every laugh masked loss. At night, when the house was quiet, I would sometimes find myself reaching for the letter I wrote to Mary at Dunkirk, the one I never sent. I kept it folded in my wallet, a reminder of what could have been and what was still possible. One winter evening, as the frost settled on the window panes, I took Mary's hand and told her about that letter. I read it aloud. She didn't cry, but I saw tears welling in her eyes. She squeezed my hand and said, "You came back. That's what matters." I nodded, but inside I felt the weight of all those who didn't. Some days I visited the local war memorial with my boys. We stood in silence, the names etched in stone like ghosts waiting to be remembered. I told them stories of bravery, of fear, and of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. I wanted them to know the truth, even if it was hard. Work helped too. Delivering posts gave me a rhythm, a reason to be part of the world again. Rain or shine, I walked those streets, greeting neighbours, chatting with shopkeepers, and sometimes pausing to watch children play. Their laughter was a balm, a sign that life would go on. But no matter how far I walked or how much time passed, the sea called to me. Sometimes I dreamt of the channel, the waves crashing, the little boats bobbing on the water, the sky streaked with smoke and fire. I wondered what became of the men who never made it home. In those moments, I felt a profound loneliness, a solitude not of distance but of memory. I carried the burden of survival, the weight of being one of the few who escaped. Yet I was determined not to let those memories break me. Instead, I wanted to honor them by living fully, by loving deeply, by remembering without bitterness. Dunkirk was a chapter of my life that shaped me, defined me, and haunted me. But it was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new kind of battle, the one fought in the silence after the guns fell quiet. The years after the war felt like walking through a fog, uncertain, slow, and sometimes painfully cold. But slowly, life began to stitch itself back together. The city rebuilt. Neighbours helped neighbours, and families tried to find normalcy amid the echoes of loss. Mary and I settled into our small flat on the edge of East London. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I remember the first night we moved. No electricity, just the soft glow of a candle and the faint smell of damp walls. We sat on the floor, tired but hopeful, and made plans for the future. Raising two boys in a post-war world was its own challenge. They were the light in the darkness, reminding me every day why survival mattered. Peter, the younger one, was curious and bright-eyed, always asking questions about the world. I tried to answer honestly but gently, shielding him from the horrors I carried inside. His older brother, David, was more quiet, often lost in his own thoughts, like he carried a weight of his own. Work at the post office was steady but uninspiring. Still, it gave me routine and purpose. I enjoyed the simple things: delivering letters from distant relatives, packages with treats for children, postcards from the seaside. It was a small way to connect people, to keep hope alive. I joined the local veterans group, a rough and tumble crowd with stories that matched my own. We shared laughter, drinks, and sometimes tears. Talking helped, but it also stirred old wounds. Some nights, after a few pints, the memories came crashing back. The cries on the beach, the faces of friends lost, the hopelessness and fury of it all. One man, Tom, became like a brother. He lost his leg in the retreat but kept a fierce spirit. We'd sit for hours in the pub, reliving the war and dreaming of peace. He told me once, "We're the lucky ones, Alfie. Lucky to tell the tale. Lucky to carry the scars." I wasn't sure I felt lucky. Some days, I felt broken inside, trapped by memories as real as the day they happened. Mary was my rock through it all. When I couldn't speak, she listened. When I couldn't sleep, she stayed awake with me. When I wanted to run away from it all, she reminded me of the life we built together. She was the reason I kept going. Slowly, I began to tell the story. Not just to the veterans, but to my boys, to neighbors, to anyone who would listen. I wanted them to understand that war was not glory and medals, but fear, loss, and sacrifice. That the miracle of Dunkirk was a story of human grit, not magic. I visited Hamish's family again, several times over the years. His mother was always there, a comforting presence, offering stew and a warm fire. She treated me like a son, and I kept his cap on their mantle, a silent tribute to a friendship cut short. As the years passed, the world changed. The bombs stopped falling, cities grew taller, and new generations were born who never knew the war except through stories and books. I watched my boys grow up. David became a teacher, and Peter, after much coaxing, joined the Royal Navy, inspired by tales of bravery and resilience. I never told them everything, not the darkest parts, not the moments when I felt like giving up. But I gave them the truth about courage, the courage to keep living when all seems lost. Even now, sitting here at 99, I can feel the threads of those years woven into every part of me. The war shaped me, but it didn't break me. It taught me about friendship, about sacrifice, and about the strength of the human spirit. And though the silence after the guns has been long, the story lives on, in the hearts of those who remember, and in the hope of those who come after. In the quiet moments when the world feels still, that haunting silence creeps in. The silence after the guns have stopped firing, after the smoke has cleared. It's a silence full of ghosts. Sometimes I still hear the echoes of Dunkirk, not the sounds of battle, but the quiet that followed. The heavy hush of a place emptied of life yet full of memory. That silence wraps around me like a shroud, reminding me of what was lost and what was barely saved. I remember walking the beach, years later, long after the war had ended, when the sand was peaceful, and the only sounds were the waves and the calls of seabirds. The stretch of shoreline looked so calm, so innocent, nothing like the hell it had once been. But I knew every footprint in that sand was a story, every shell casing, every abandoned helmet, a testament to the men who fought and died. And every wave that lapped the shore seemed to carry the whispers of those who never made it home. Sometimes, I'd close my eyes and try to hear their voices. A boy named Hamish, laughing one moment and gone the next. Jenkins, scribbling his final thoughts in a tattered notebook. Reggie Brown, who vanished in smoke and fire. Their faces would flash in my mind, vivid and painful. There were nights when the silence was so loud I thought it might swallow me whole. I'd wake in a sweat, heart pounding, the nightmares vivid and unrelenting. I'd see the burning ships, the screaming men, the faces of those I couldn't save. But I learned to live with it, not by forgetting, but by remembering with purpose. Began visiting schools and local halls to talk about the war, not the heroic tales, but the truth, the fear, the camaraderie, the loss. I wanted young people to understand what it meant to be a soldier, what it meant to survive, and what it meant to carry those memories for the rest of your life. Some listened with wide eyes, others seemed distant, as if the stories belonged to another world. But a few asked questions, good questions, good. They wanted to know what courage really looked like, what friendship in war felt like, and how a boy from East London could find hope amid despair. Sharing the story was a kind of healing. It didn't erase the pain, but it made it less heavy. Mary stood by me through it all. She never questioned why some nights I was quiet, or why other times I'd speak for hours about the past. She understood that the war wasn't just a chapter in my life, it was a part of me. And sometimes, in that silence, I'd hear a new sound. The laughter of my grandchildren playing in the garden, the soft voice of Mary reading a book, the gentle hum of a world moving forward. That silence was no longer empty, it was filled with life. The war ended, but the echoes never faded. They followed me home like shadows at dusk, quiet, persistent, and unwelcome. I wanted to leave Dunkirk behind on that beach, buried beneath sand and sea spray, but it clung to me, wrapped around my bones. At night, sometimes I woke up in a cold sweat, hearing the scream of the Stukas or the crack of a distant rifle. Sometimes I felt Hamish's absence like a weight on my chest. It wasn't just grief, it was guilt, the kind that doesn't go away. Why me? Why not him? Why did I survive when so many didn't? Mary noticed. She saw the faraway look in my eyes, the way I'd drift during family dinners, the silence that fell over me like a blanket I couldn't shake off. She never asked me to talk about it, but her presence was my tether. She was the quiet strength I clung to. I found work delivering post, a simple job that gave me routine and a chance to walk without thinking too much. Letters came and went, some filled with hope, others with sorrow. I saw the world move on, while part of me stayed frozen in that moment on the beach. I didn't tell my boys about the war, at least not until Peter asked me that one day. It was the hardest conversation of my life. How do you explain fear, death, and hope to a child? I told him the truth I'd learned the hard way. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about moving forward despite it. I kept Hamish's cap on the mantle as a reminder, a symbol of friendship, loss, and the promise I made to live, not just survive. As the years passed, the war's weight settled into the quiet corners of my mind. I buried myself in routine, in the small rituals of daily life. The morning paper, the familiar faces of neighbours, the chatter at the local pub where I sometimes met old comrades. But even there, the memories lingered beneath the surface, unspoken, but always present. Sometimes, I'd catch myself staring at the channel through the kitchen window, as if expecting to see the tiny boats returning, ghosts of that desperate rescue. The sea had a way of pulling me back to those days, the endless waiting, the hope, the terror. It was like a wound that never fully healed, always aching beneath the skin. I visited Hamish's family a few more times. His mother always welcomed me with open arms, cooking stews that tasted like home and memories. His father and siblings treated me like one of their own, sharing stories of Hamish's childhood that I never knew. It comforted me, knowing that piece of him lived on in there, laughter and tears. I tried to tell my story sometimes, but words felt fragile. How do you explain the chaos of war? The moments of bravery mixed with sheer panic, the smell of burning rubber, the screams, the silence after the shells stopped falling. Jenkins, with his journal, was right. People should know, but not everyone was ready to listen. Decades later, when the country held memorials and ceremonies, I found myself among crowds of men in old uniforms, faces weathered like mine. The young soldiers stood silent, trying to imagine what it was like. Some asked questions, others just watched, wide-eyed. I realized then that Dunkirk wasn't just a memory, it was a legacy, a lesson in resilience, sacrifice, and the cost of freedom. It shaped a generation, even if we didn't fully understand it at the time. The miracle of Dunkirk became a symbol, one I both resented and revered. It was no miracle, really. It was men, boys, and civilians, bound by desperation and determination. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Sometimes I thought about the future, my sons, their children, the world they'd inherit. I hoped they'd understand what we endured, not just as history, but as a human story. Not just about battles and strategies, but about courage in the face of fear, friendship amidst chaos, and the cost of survival. I still carry it with me, not just in memories, but in the way I live. Slowly, carefully, appreciating the small moments, a child's laughter, a quiet morning, the scent of fresh bread. These are the things we fought for, the things worth remembering. The years after the war passed like shadows lengthening at dusk. I watched the world change, slowly at first, then faster than I could keep up. Cities rebuilt from rubble, children born in peace, technology that seemed like magic to the boy I once was. Yet in the quiet moments, when the wind carried a salty tang or a distant engine's hum, I was pulled back to that beach at Dunkirk, the place where time had stopped and the world had held its breath. I never became a hero. No parades, no medals pinned to my chest, just a man who survived. I think sometimes the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home, the ones whose stories are whispers in the wind, their names etched on cold stone memorials. I carry their memory with me like a sacred flame. I've learned that peace isn't just the absence of war, but the presence of something worth fighting for. Family, hope, kindness. I found that in Mary's steady hand, in my boy's laughter, in the friendships that outlasted the years, and even in the scars that never fully healed, there was grace, the miracle of Dunkirk, they called it. But it was never about miracles. It was about ordinary men, caught in the storm, choosing to stand when everything else told them to fall. It was about holding on, when hope was a thin thread, fragile but unbreakable. I want those who listen to know this. Courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it is the quiet voice at the day's end that says, "I will try again tomorrow." It is the will to keep going, even when the night feels endless. Now, as I sit by the window watching sparrows flit and chase, I feel the weight of those days less heavily. Not because I forget, but because I've made peace with them. The boy I was, the man I became, and the memories in between, they are all part of a life shaped by fire and resilience. So, if this story finds you, know this. Dunkirk was not just a battle. It was a testament to the strength hidden inside us all. And I, Alfred Turner, once trapped on that beach, carry that testament with me. Always. The sea still whispers, and I still listen. Years have passed since the guns fell silent and the beaches emptied. Dunkirk remains frozen in time, not just as a place on a map, but as a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and the unyielding human spirit. I often wonder, how many stories like mine remain untold? Voices buried beneath the sands, unheard by history. Each soldier, each civilian, each crewman on those little boats who braved the channel carried a piece of something much bigger than themselves, a hope that flickered against the darkness. In classrooms today, young people learn about Dunkirk as a miraculous evacuation, a turning point in a brutal war. But miracles don't carry the weight of mud-caked uniforms, the screams of the wounded, or the silent prayers whispered by frightened men facing death. Remembering is more than recounting facts. It is honoring the truth, the pain and the courage intertwined. It is the duty of every generation to listen, to learn, and to carry those lessons forward, lest history repeat its darkest chapters. My own journey ended quietly, far from the roar of battle, but I carry those days with me still. When the wind blows just right, I swear I hear Hamish's laugh, the drone of planes overhead, the gentle creak of those tiny boats returning for us. Dunkirk was not only a rescue, it was a testament to humanity's capacity for hope amidst despair, to the strength we find when we stand together. So if you ever find yourself staring out at the sea, remember the boys who stood on that beach. Remember Alfred Turner. Remember that courage is often found in the smallest, quietest acts. The refusal to give up, the hand extended to a stranger, the faith that tomorrow might still hold a chance. Because in those moments, we are all survivors. Was trapped at Dunkirk, and I will never forget. Alfred Turner. Subscribe and dive into more incredible stories.